Now, you'll be forgiven for thinking it's a Thursday because Paul Horrocks is with us, but he's joined us this morning because we're also joined by Theresa Villiers, Shadow Transport Secretary. Thank you very much for coming in this morning. You're here to gauge local views about the proposed congestion charge, but we'll start with some stories you've picked out. The first one being front page of the Daily Telegraph, £50 billion to nationalise the Rock. Northern Rock this is, isn't it? So
it is. And the reason I picked that out is that it's just looking increasingly grim for that situation. I mean, it looks less and less like the government are going to find the private buyer that they said they were going to, and unfortunately it looks like that 50 billion bill is more and more looking like it's going to be taxpayers who are picking up the bill, which is a real concern. And I think taking into account we haven't had a run on a bank in this country for over 100 years. This is really damaging to our international credibility. A lot of our economy is dependent on banking. And I think it's seriously gloomy news on this that we're reading in the Telegraph.
So were they wrong to bail them out in the first place?
Clearly something had to be done, but it's really unfortunate, I think, that the Chancellor hasn't been able so far to deliver on what he clearly wanted to do, which was to find a private buyer for it. They just haven't been able to achieve what they want to do. And I think the whole thing illustrates that probably so much could have been done to avoid this situation if we'd had stronger rules to intervene to stop the situation happening in the first place.
Is it not out of their hands if they can't find a buyer? And then, what's the alternative? Just watch it crumble?
Well, certainly no one wants to sit back and watch it crumble, but I think it's unfortunate that, the Chancellor, Alison Darlings, really seems to be letting the situation run away with him, and he's not able to deliver what he said he wanted. And, I mean, for example, I think it's interesting to contrast that headline with another story I wanted to look at, people protesting about the Woodhead Tunnel. I mean, if we're going to see, money poured into propping up Northern Rock because the Chancellor can't find his private buyer, it puts more pressure on spending in other areas like transport, like rail. I think a lot of people are really concerned about this government's record in not always spending taxpayers' money wisely and not always giving taxpayers value for money. And if they can't find a sort of workable solution at Northern Rock without the taxpayer having to stump up for billions, then I think that's really unfortunate. It has a real knock-on impact on other areas where people do want money spent. One
of the stories that emerged at the weekend that I found amazing, and I think the public will be outraged, is that some of the senior management at Northern Rock are still going to get their bonuses. How can that be when Northern Rock is in such a financial mess? And one of the memos, I think, had been sent out by the new chief executive was to say to senior staff, if you talk about this bonus, if you declare it, if you make it public, you won't get it. Well, isn't that incredible that a bank like this, in such trouble, can now be paying quite big bonuses of sort of £25,000, £30,000 to some senior managers?
The whole thing's a complete mess.
Let's move on to the story you mentioned, Paul. It was across the papers yesterday that we might be moving towards a system of assumed consent when it comes to organ donations.
Well, at the Manchester Evening News, we've been long in favour of this system. I think that people currently have to opt in to organ donation, when it would be far better if they simply was accepted that they would automatically give consent unless they opted out. 1,000 people plus die every year waiting for organ donation. And I think that this system that Gordon Brown says he's now in favour of would be much fairer to all those people on the waiting list.
It's a no-brainer, Theresa, isn't it?
I'm inclined to agree with Paul. I mean, this is something, it's a very delicate issue, and I think it's an issue where a debate in Parliament could be really sort of constructive. So I'm going to be keen to listen to that to see how a scheme will work in practice. But, yeah, my instinctive reaction is to shift to an opt-out system I think there must be a strong case.
You agree with the government?
Yeah, well, I do on occasions. I think, given I don't give the Prime Minister credit for very much, but I think
isn't this interfering in people's lives in a way that the Tories don't generally like to do?
I don't know. I don't think it's if you put the proper safeguards in. I don't think it necessarily has to involve, unnecessary and unwelcome interference. You do need proper safeguards. Obviously, it's an incredibly sensitive time if someone's just been bereaved, relatives need to be properly consulted. And as I say, we've got a long way to go before we make a final decision on it.
And I suppose the challenge is making sure everyone knows that they can opt out.
Absolutely, and how they do it and making it easy for them. But I can't help feeling that shifting the system will save lives. So that's why I'm inclined to be quite sympathetic with what the Prime Minister said this weekend.
Religious objections. I think some faiths will find this a very difficult moral decision. But the fact is, if the proper safeguards are put in place, and it's made clear to all of us, that if you are against this, all you have to do is fill out a simple form and carry the card. Then I can't see a problem with it. Okay. And it will save lives. It works in Spain, it works in other parts of Europe. Why can't it work in the UK?
Now, we've got to move on to the congestion charge debate, which goes on and on and on in Greater Manchester. And at the moment, it's so relevant, which is presumably why you're here. Just remind us what the sort of Conservative Party line is on it.
Well, our approach on these local schemes is that we don't oppose them all in principle, but we feel that it's very important that the decision taken on whether you go for congestion charging is taken by the local community in that particular area.
So you'd like to see a referendum across Greater Manchester?
Well, I think there are a variety of ways to look at sort of local consent, and a referendum is certainly one option, which could be appealing in different contexts. I wouldn't say there's necessarily one model that fits everywhere, but a real concern we have is that the way the government's approach funding, they've essentially said to Manchester, OK, well, we'll give you some money as long as you introduce congestion charging. And we think that's wrong, because that's essentially interfering in the local decision. I know a lot of people here have called it basically blackmail. We think the government should look at the bids for public transport funding objectively and not try and skew them in a particular direction.
But is the long-term objective not to, generate the revenue in order to fund it in the long term, an improved public transport system?
Well, I mean, certainly that's a significant element of the scheme proposed here. And I think one thing that people are concerned about is initially it was sort of billed as, we'll get this big chunk of money from the government if we introduce congestion charging. Whereas if you look at the small print, yes, if it goes ahead, there would be a contribution from central funds.
But this is a huge amount of money.
There would also be a burden on local taxpayers as well.
But it's a £3 billion chunk, isn't it? What would the Tories give us that amount of money without it being part of it being a loan?
When we get into power, we'll have to look at the books and see what's affordable in terms of spending on this particular project and how far it's gone. So, I mean, I'm not in a position to say now exactly what money will be spent and what will be allocated.
But then aren't you criticising Labour for saying, yeah, OK, we'll give you this chunk of money with part of it being a loan, without saying yourself how you would fund it?
What we want is the decision on funding to be based on, the objective merits of the proposals concerned, rather than necessarily pushing a particular community down a particular road.
At the end of the day, nobody really wants congestion charging. But what we're facing in Greater Manchester is what London has faced and has had to deal with, and that is chronic overcrowding on the roads. And I think this is just one of those awful bitter pills that eventually may have to be swallowed. I agree with you that the issue of sort of blackmailing us into this position, saying, you can have a certain amount of money, and let's face it, it's a lot of money. There's £1 billion on offer here. The further £2 billion has to be paid back. But are we really going to turn round when it comes to it and say we don't want potentially a £3 billion injection into our transport infrastructure, which could make us world-class public transport? My own view is that if we are to actually take that route, then there should be some independent European scrutiny of the improvements in public transport to say that they are real, that they have happened before the congestion charge is implemented.